Let's talk about epigenetics. Karen had a longer road to hoe than most people that come to our Reversing Diabetes Seminars because she had to learn this with me. When she got her labs back, she knew that something had to change. Her triglycerides were 587, her cholesterol was 263, her insulin resistance was 15, and her weight was 200. She was a registered nurse, but she didn't know what lifestyle modifications she could do to make her numbers better. And all she got from her doctor is go home and take this pill. And that had a little lackluster to it. She did have a genetic predisposition for diabetes. Her mother had diabetes, and she knew with those kind of numbers that diabetes was also in her near future. We were invited to help present a Reversing Diabetes video series with Chuck Cleveland. He says, I'll mentor you in the program. And the program had been put out by Lifestyle Centers of America, and it was our first introduction to the concept, really, that you could reverse this disease. And as we went through the program, she did pretty well until she found the connection with fats, and she became angry. She became angry that her doctor didn't know and hadn't told her the impact fats could have on your triglycerides. And she stayed angry for several weeks. But I guess it was a driving force to make the changes at home. So we began gradually making the changes, and it took us a while. We didn't have a cut dry, 1, 2, 3, 4, these are the things that you need to do. It was more like, well, here's a concept, and here's a concept, and just see what you can do with this concept. So we decided we needed something a little more concrete, and as we would come across items, we began latching onto them. And this was actually one of the formative things that got us into doing what we're doing here today. But those were her numbers now. These are her numbers after. Triglycerides are down to a fairly respectable 157. Cholesterol is down to 180. Insulin resistance is down to a 4.6 and should be below 2. So she's got a little bit of work to do yet, but she has made a tremendous amount of progress. Absolutely. Let's celebrate the success. And when you walk into our kitchen at home, the landscape of the kitchen does not look anything like what it used to look. The things you find there are very different. You find a lot of the high nutrient foods. We eat more simply than we did before. There's a lot less junk food. There's certainly a lot less cheese. You never find at home, we actually eat all plant-based at home now. And so that also was a big change. So there is no way that Karen will ever go back. There's no way Steve will go back. We are healthier now than we have been in quite some time, and so we are personally reaping the results. So people ask us, I said, well, you know, you all are so skinny, we just don't see that you have a diabetes problem. Guys, we've been there. We have that t-shirt. Gregor Mendel was probably the person that is most responsible for the study of genetics. Back in the 1800s, he was a monastery growing peas in his garden. He was crossing different strains of peas and kept very careful records of how these peas would, how the characteristics would express themselves. So he's the father of what we call today genetics. But genetics doesn't explain all the things that happened. You know, I have people that ask me all the time, well, if I inherited diabetes from my parents, how can I avoid or reverse something that was handed down to me genetically? I have the genes for it. Well, we know now that that is a myth. You know, Gregor Mendel taught us that we got half of our genes from our parents and half of them from our mothers, but that's not the whole story either. There's an extra twist to this story. So the myths are you were dealt a hand of genes at birth, you are who you are, there's nothing you can do to change it. A lot of people I meet out there will say, well, the way I look at it, when the good Lord pulls your number, you're going to go. Well, the good Lord made you steward of the body he gave you. And if you take care of the body he gave you, you can impact the outcome significantly. And we've seen that many, many times over in science. So we do not have to accept the destiny that we have been handed genetically. Our bodies were built to be very adaptable to our environment. And as it adapts to our environment, our genes express themselves in different ways. We really learned this first with identical twins, because as we studied identical twins throughout their lifetimes, we began to recognize that you can have these identical twins who have exactly the same genome, and one of the twins might develop diabetes, and the other one remain diabetes-free. One might develop obesity, and the other one remain lean. You might have one that develops cancer, while the other one remains cancer-free. And there is a genetic component to every disease. If you don't have the genes for a disease, you won't get the disease. So the answer to what is going on, why do we see this, lies in this new science called epigenetics. Epi means on top of, and genetics means your genes, the way that you were programmed. So there are factors out there that are on top of your genes which impact the way that the genes express themselves in the first place. And that can cause various outcomes. Now this is really a very new science. It was first reported in a public way on January the 10th, 2010. Science had known about it for a little bit before that and had been working in the laboratories, but this is when it broke in a public way. And the story goes like this. Randy Jertle was the director of the Genomics laboratory at Duke University, North Carolina. And while there, they were working with some AGOUTI mice. Now, the AGOUTI mice have a gene that causes them to have a yellow coat instead of the brown coat. They have gain a lot of weight, they develop cardiovascular disease, and they'll die prematurely of cancer. What they decided to do with these AGOUTI gene is they wanted to feed the mother a special diet to see if there was any way that they could change the AGOUTI expression. And when they did this, the offspring were normal. Offspring typically would have the same parental characteristics. They would be fat, yellow as pink, fat like little pin cushions. They'd be yellow. They would gain the heart disease and cancers and diabetes and die early. And yet their offspring this time were born normal. They were little brown mice. They did not have the problems with weight gain. They didn't get diabetes. They didn't get cancers. They didn't develop the cardiovascular disease. They were just sleek, slim, and brown, and they actually lived to a normal lifespan. So scientists ultimately concluded that even though that after they studied the genome of these two creatures, these different generations, they discovered that they had exactly the same genome, but the only thing that had changed was the mother's diet. It was a toxic diet that caused the AGOUTI gene to be expressed in the first place. Well, the lessons learned from this, there can be same genes but different expressions of those genes. The diet changed the way that the genes worked. Now, as I was presenting this in another lecture, someone sitting right on the front row said, well, I don't care about rats. What about humans? The very next slide that I had was this one. The Pima Indians of Arizona happen to have the highest diabetes rate of any people group in the world. Greater than 50% of the population has diabetes. They weren't always that way. For more than 2,000 years, they earned their living in agriculture. They're farmers. And they would irrigate their farms with the water from the Salt and Gila rivers. And life was good for them until Western expansion. And as settlers went across the United States and settled upriver from them, they began diverting the waters from the Salt and Gila rivers to irrigate their own crops. And pretty soon, the Pima discovered they were facing starvation. And as they began to die off because of this starvation, they said, what can we do? What can we do? Well, you know, you try to defend yourself, you try to war against the people that are moving in, but they just keep moving, and keep coming. So the U.S. government stepped in with an answer. They said, we're going to solve your problem for you. And so they gave them commodities: white flour, shortening, lard rather, and sugar. And so the Pima now were forced to eke out an existence using these commodities to supplement whatever else they were able to grow in those arid lands that they lived in. Things were bad for the Pima until the war. World War II, a lot of the Pima Indians were drafted into the Army. They were enlisted in the Army into primarily Caucasian units, and they began to eat the standard American diet. The ladies left home, and they went to work to help support themselves. They worked in factories supporting the war effort, and with those additional incomes, they were able to buy good foods. And life was good for a little while, but when the war ended, it came to a crashing halt. The men returned home, and with them, they brought their appetites for the standard American diet, for the fast food that we eat. And the obesity needle began to change big time for them. The rates of diabetes skyrocketed, and they found themselves in a great deal of trouble. There is another group of Pima Indians who got separated from them over time. They now live, instead of living up here around the Salt and Gila rivers just south of Phoenix, they live down here in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico. The scientists have tested their genome. They share exactly the same genome as their cousins up in Arizona. But they have virtually no instance of diabetes. They still farm the same way that they farmed before. They eat the same foods that they ate before, a predominantly plant-based, high-fiber diet. And there's virtually no instance of diabetes in their population. So what made the difference? It was something in the lifestyle that made the difference. If you see the Pima today, you more than likely see them around tourist traps or something like that. And as you can see from just looking at them, just about everyone carries the same problem. So what we learned they were the same genome, but it was something in the lifestyle that triggered the difference between the two groups of Pima. And factors in the Sierra Madre Mountains were what actually prevented them from getting the disease. And it was those factors of an active lifestyle, we believe now, and their diet. So let's move on and let's talk about another study. There's another very landmark study. You can hardly talk about epigenetics without talking about this one. And by the way, if any of you have the opportunity, I want you to go to Dean Ornish's website and just read the results of some of the scientific studies that man has churned out over the last 25 years or so. It's just absolutely phenomenal. He first made his mark in medicine back around 1990 when he published a report where he had actually documented that they were able to reverse cardiovascular disease. Around that time, I was working in cardiology, and in fact, I worked cardiology for many years. And we would always tell our patients cardiovascular disease is an irreversible disease. That was common teaching at that time. And when his information came on, it actually sent me over to it just compelled me to go to the medical library and do a lot of research. I said, what would happen if we would start doing everything that we possibly could do to reverse cardiovascular disease? What would the outcomes be? And I spent many, many, many hours back there studying those things. But anyway, that sort of got me on the road to asking the same question. What would happen if we do everything we could do for diabetes? Could we reverse it? Anyway, lifestyle program. What he did with people back then, he put them on a strict lifestyle program, and they had to eat a plant-based diet. They could have no fats, no sugars in the diet. They had to have moderate exercise, and they had to have stress management. I think he did yoga with them in order to manage that. And he documented their cardiovascular disease with heart caths before and after. Okay. What he decided to do with the men then was he selected 30 men who had prostate cancer. And these 30 men, he enrolled in his study with the express interest of seeing if lifestyle changes could somehow affect gene expression. Well, these men that were enrolled in the study had all turned down traditional treatment for cancer. And so once they got them in the program, they decided that they would do a battery of tests before them, and then a battery of tests afterwards, which included genetic testing. Well, the results of the study were nothing less than phenomenal. All the men lost weight. All the men had lower blood pressure. They all had lower cholesterol levels. In all men, their tumors shrank. And all the men experienced major epigenetic changes. Now, we know that every disease has a genetic component, right? Same thing is true for prostate cancer. So what they did is they studied the genes. You know, we had the Human Genome Project that was we got into with President Ronald Reagan many years ago in the late 1980s. And it was anticipated that this would be a 60-year project. It was supposed to take us 60 years to unravel the human genome. And this was a project that was undertaken by multiple countries, not just one country. So lots of scientists were involved. It only took them 13 years to map out the human genome. So by the time that Dr. Ornish did his study, we had already identified 453 genes that were known to cause disease. They were disease-promoting genes. And we had identified at that point 48 genes that were known to prevent disease. At the end of the study, they redid their genetic testing. What they found was that these genes did an 100% flip-flop. Those 453 disease-promoting genes had all been turned off. And the promoting genes had been turned off, the preventing genes had been turned on. That really uncovered something that's very significant for people who are studying lifestyle changes. He accidentally, if you please, studied upon a methodology whereby we can cause our genes to express themselves differently. At least this many of those genes we know are susceptible to that. So from the prostate cancer study, we learned that lifestyle changes can turn off the bad genes and turn on the good genes. And that means there's hope for all of those people who are studying diseases which have genetic predispositions. How many diseases have genetic predispositions? All diseases. That includes diabetes. There's a genetic predisposition for diabetes. So the best approach that we want to do is to select those lifestyle things that we can find which are going to bring us the optimal epigenetic outcome. Epigenetic research continues at an amazing rate. The government looked at these studies and they realized that there was a tremendous amount of benefit to be had in this area. So they National Institutes of Health allocated $190 million to be spent over the next 5 years in epigenetic research. Dr. Charlotte Ling from Lund University reported in March of 2014 that as of that point in time, they had identified over 800 genes which had epigenetic changes which could impact your diabetes. So the research is continuing. But they said that of all these changes, the most significant ways that it appears that we can impact those genes are through diet, exercise, and other lifestyle choices. Well, is that something that's out of our reach? There are millions of dollars being spent right now on developing medications that will cause epigenetic changes in your body, and I understand several of them are already on the market. But do we have to wait for these genes to be tested in order for us to do that? Epigenetics changes actually modify your gene expressions, but they don't change the genetic sequence. They occur within one organism's lifetime, but it can actually be passed on to your offspring up to the third and fourth generation. So, what could these be? Well, there's a couple mechanisms according to the National Institutes of Health. One of those is called methylation. You see a little methyl group here, comes along and fastens itself to the outside of the DNA strand. When that happens, it can express the way that the gene expresses itself. When the DNA replicates itself and divides, that little methyl group will just replicate itself as well, and the new gene oftentimes can carry that through to succeeding generations. That's one possible mechanism that's being theorized, and it seems to hold the greatest weight as far as what I can tell. Another is called histone modification. As the DNA molecule, it's a very convoluted molecule, but it'll wrap itself around a protein. They call it a histone. And these histones, when the DNA is wrapped around the histone, if it's wrapped real tightly, then there's no way for the gene to express itself. But if you unroll it a little bit, then over here, where it's pink, you can see that that gene would be expressible. There's a third way, and that's histone tail modification. These proteins have little tails on them that stick out. We call histone tails, and you can have an epigenetic factor, we believe, that will attach to those. So those are three mechanisms. Now, why do I mention the mechanisms? Well, I wouldn't mention them if they didn't have significance. And part of the significance is what we can do about it. Another part of it is, well, DNA damage happens all the time in every body. In fact, it's really common. DNA damage happens as much as 10,000 times per day in each and every cell in your body. Now, you have a repair mechanism, a DNA repair mechanism that helps repair those. You have repair genes, and they're constantly about the business of repairing damage that is done to that DNA strand. One of the things that appears to be extremely important in facilitating the repair and in preventing the damage in the first place are antioxidants, especially the colorful pigments in the foods that you eat. That's one reason why I say eat every color of the rainbow every day. You all get A's today. This is an A class, I can tell. Okay, anyway, these antioxidant-rich foods are what we need to be putting down and eating a lot of, because it reduces DNA damage in the first place. It lowers the oxidative stress, which causes increased damage. Oxidative stress really ramps up that DNA damage, so this quells that and takes care of several problems here all at the same time. It can also cause methylation to occur. It's those pigments that will supply the methyl groups which attach to your DNA, which make you well. That is why we need to eat every color of the rainbow every day. Okay, from a historical perspective, it has to be an epigenetic change that has caused our problem. Think back. Just 115 years ago, there were only 2 persons with diabetes for every 1,000 in the population. Today, there are 120 people for every 1,000 in the population, and in just 15 years, there will be 240 people with diabetes for every 100 in the population. There is no way that a genetic mutation could have caused that problem. Somebody was already carrying the gene, and it has to have been something from a genetic change that has caused it. Dr. Francis Collins is the current director of the National Institutes of Health. He formerly was the man that led us in the Human Genome Project. And he says, genetics loads the gun, and environment pulls the trigger. So what have we learned in this class? We have learned that people can carry genes that predispose them to disease. But how those genes are expressed depends on how you contact yourself with your environment. What is the biggest way we contact ourselves with the environment? It's through our food. So the number one thing that we can do is food. The second most important thing we can do is exercise. And the third most important thing we can do is all those other lifestyle changes that we know bring us about to good health. And that can actually change the course of our diabetes.